Joseph Conrad. This book contains 173 pages and is divided into 5 chapters. To Edward Garnett, this tale of my friends of the sea. Chapter 1. Mr. Baker, chief mate of the ship Narcissus, stepped in one stride out of his lighted cabin into the darkness of the quarter-deck. Above his head, on the break of the poop, the night watchman rang a double stroke. It was 9 o'clock. Mr. Baker, speaking up to the man above him, asked, "Are all the hands aboard, Knowles?" The man limped down the ladder, then said reflectively, "I think so, sir. All our old chaps are there, and a lot of new men has come. They must be all there." "Tell the boatswain to send all hands aft," went on Mr. Baker, "and tell one of the youngsters to bring a good lamp here. I want to muster our crowd." The main deck was dark aft, but halfway from forward, through the open doors of the forecastle, 2 streaks of brilliant light cut the shadow of the quiet night that lay upon the ship. A hum of voices was heard there, while port and starboard in the illuminated doorways, silhouettes of moving men appeared for a moment, very black, without relief, like figures cut out of sheet tin. The ship was ready for sea. The carpenter had driven in the last wedge of the main hatch battens, and throwing down his maul, had wiped his face with great deliberation just on the stroke of 5. The decks had been swept, the windlass oiled, and made ready to heave up the anchor. The big tow rope lay in long bights along one side of the main deck, with one end carried up and hung over the bows, in readiness for the tug that would come paddling and hissing noisily, hot and smoky, in the limpid, cool quietness of the early morning. The captain was ashore, where he had been engaging some new hands to make up his full crew, and, the work of the day over, the ship's officers had kept out of the way, glad of a little breathing time. Soon after dark, the few Liberty men and the new hands began to arrive in shore boats rowed by white-clad Asiatics, who clamored fiercely for payment before coming alongside the gangway ladder. The feverish and shrill babble of Eastern language struggled against the masterful tones of tipsy seamen, who argued against brazen claims and dishonest hopes by profane shouts. The resplendent and bestarred peace of the East was torn into squalid tatters by howls of rage and shrieks of lament, raised over sums ranging from 5 annas to half a rupee. And every soul afloat in Bombay harbor became aware that the new hands were joining the Narcissus. Gradually, the distracting noise had subsided. The boats came no longer in splashing clusters of 3 or 4 together, but dropped alongside singly, in a subdued buzz of expostulation cut short by a "Not a pice more! You go to the devil!" from some man staggering up the accommodation ladder, a dark figure, with a long bag poised on the shoulder. In the forecastle, the newcomers, upright and swaying amongst corded boxes and bundles of bedding, made friends with the old hands, who sat one above another in the 2 tiers of bunks, gazing at their future shipmates with glances critical but friendly. The 2 forecastle lamps were turned up high, and shed an intense, hard glare. Shore-going round hats were pushed far on the backs of heads, or rolled about on the deck amongst the chain cables. White collars, undone, stuck out on each side of red faces. Big arms in white sleeves gesticulated. The growling voices hummed steady amongst bursts of laughter and hoarse calls. "Here, sonny, take that bunk. Don't you do it. What's your last ship? I know her. 3 years ago in Puget Sound. This here berth leaks, I tell you. Come on, give us a chance to swing that chest. Did you bring a bottle, any of you shore toffs? Give us a bit of baccy. I know her. Her skipper drank himself to death. He was a dandy boy. Liked his lotion inside, he did. No. Hold your row, you chaps. I tell you, you came on board a hooker where they get their money's worth out of poor Jack by..." A little fellow called Crake and nicknamed Belfast abused the ship violently, romancing on principle just to give the new hands something to think over. Archie, sitting aslant on his sea-chest, kept his knees out of the way and pushed the needle steadily through a white patch in a pair of blue trousers. Men in black jackets and stand-up collars, mixed with men barefooted, bare-armed, with colored shirts open on hairy chests, pushed against one another in the middle of the forecastle. The crowd swayed, reeled, turning upon itself with the motion of a scrimmage, in a haze of tobacco smoke. All were speaking together, swearing at every second word. A Russian Finn, wearing a yellow shirt with pink stripes, stared upwards, dreamy-eyed, from under a mop of tumbled hair. Two young giants with smooth baby faces, two Scandinavians, helped each other to spread their bedding, silent and smiling placidly at the tempest of good-humored and meaningless curses. Old Singleton, the oldest able seaman in the ship, sat apart on the deck right under the lamps, stripped to the waist, tattooed like a cannibal chief all over his powerful chest and enormous biceps. Between the blue and red patterns, his white skin gleamed like satin. His bare back was propped against the heel of the bowsprit, and he held a book at arm's length before his big sunburnt face. With his spectacles and a venerable white beard, he resembled a learned and savage patriarch, the incarnation of barbarian wisdom, serene in the blasphemous turmoil of the world. He was intensely absorbed, and as he turned the pages, an expression of grave surprise would pass over his rugged features. He was reading Pelham. The popularity of Bulwer Lytton in the forecastles of southern-going ships is a wonderful and bizarre phenomenon. What ideas do his polished and so curiously insincere sentences awaken in the simple minds of the big children who people those dark and wandering places of the earth? What meaning can their rough, inexperienced souls find in the elegant verbiage of his pages? What excitement, what forgetfulness, what appeasement? Mystery. Is it the fascination of the incomprehensible? Is it the charm of the impossible? Or are those beings who exist beyond the pale of life stirred by his tales as by an enigmatical disclosure of a resplendent world that exists within the frontier of infamy and filth, within that border of dirt and hunger, of misery and dissipation that comes down on all sides to the water's edge of the incorruptible ocean, and is the only thing they know of life, the only thing they see of surrounding land, those lifelong prisoners of the sea? Mystery. Singleton, who had sailed to the southward since the age of 12, who in the last 45 years had lived, as we had calculated from his papers, no more than 40 months ashore, old Singleton, who boasted with the mild composure of long years well spent, that generally from the day he was paid off from one ship till the day he shipped in another, he seldom was in a condition to distinguish daylight, old Singleton sat unmoved in the clash of voices and cries, spelling through Pelham with slow labor, and lost in an absorption profound enough to resemble a trance. He breathed regularly. Every time he turned the book in his enormous and blackened hands, the muscles of his big white arms rolled slightly under the smooth skin. Hidden by the white mustache, his lips, stained with tobacco juice that trickled down the long beard, moved in inward whisper. His bleared eyes gazed fixedly from behind the glitter of black-rimmed glasses. Opposite to him, and on a level with his face, the ship's cat sat on the barrel of the windlass in the pose of a crouching chimera, blinking its green eyes at its old friend. It seemed to meditate a leap onto the old man's lap over the bent back of the ordinary seaman who sat at Singleton's feet. Young Charlie was lean and long-necked. The ridge of his backbone made a chain of small hills under the old shirt. His face of a street boy, a face precocious, sagacious, and ironic, with deep downward folds on each side of the thin, wide mouth, hung low over his bony knees. He was learning to make a lanyard knot with a bit of an old rope. Small drops of perspiration stood out on his bulging forehead. He sniffed strongly from time to time, glancing out of the corners of his restless eyes at the old seaman, who took no notice of the puzzled youngster muttering at his work. The noise increased. Little Belfast seemed in the heavy heat of the forecastle to boil with facetious fury. His eyes danced. In the crimson of his face, comical as a mask, the mouth yawned black, with strange grimaces. Facing him, a half-undressed man held his sides and, throwing his head back, laughed with wet eyelashes. Others stared with amazed eyes. Men sitting doubled up in the upper bunks smoked short pipes, swinging bare brown feet above the heads of those who, sprawling below on sea chests, listened, smiling stupidly or scornfully. Over the white rims of berths stuck out heads with blinking eyes, but the bodies were lost in the gloom of those places that resembled narrow niches for coffins in a whitewashed and lighted mortuary. Voices buzzed louder. Archie, with compressed lips, drew himself in, seemed to shrink into a smaller space, and sewed steadily, industrious and dumb. Belfast shrieked like an inspired dervish. "So I says to him, boys, says I, 'Begging your pardon, sir,' says I to that second mate of that steamer, 'begging your pardon, sir. The Board of Trade must have been drunk when they granted you your certificate.' 'What do you say?' says he, coming at me like a mad bull, all in his white clothes. And I up with my tar pot and capsizes it all over his blamed lovely face and his lovely jacket. 'Take that,' says I. 'I am a sailor anyhow, you nosin', skipper-licking, useless, superfluous, bridge-stanchion you.' 'That's the kind of man I am,' shouts I. You should have seed him skip, boys. Drowned, blind with tar he was, so—" "Don't 'ee believe him. He never upset no tar. I was there," shouted somebody. The two Norwegians sat on a chest side by side, alike and placid, resembling a pair of lovebirds on a perch, and with round eyes stared innocently. But the Russian Finn, in the racket of explosive shouts and rolling laughter, remained motionless, limp and dull, like a deaf man without a backbone. Near him, Archie smiled at his needle. A broad-chested, slow-eyed newcomer spoke deliberately to Belfast during an exhausted lull in the noise. "I wonder any of the mates here are alive yet with such a chap as you on board. I conclude they ain't that bad now, if you had the taming of them, sonny." "Not bad, not bad," screamed Belfast. "If it wasn't for us sticking together, not bad. They ain't never bad when they ain't got a chance, blast their black hearts." He foamed, whirling his arms, then suddenly grinned, and, taking a tablet of black tobacco out of his pocket, bit a piece off with a funny show of ferocity. Another new hand, a man with shifty eyes and a yellow hatchet face, who had been listening open-mouthed in the shadow of the midship locker, observed in a squeaky voice, "Well, it's a homeward trip anyhow. Bad or good, I can do it on my head, so long as I get home. And I can look after my rights. I will show 'em." All the heads turned towards him. Only the ordinary seaman and the cat took no notice. He stood with arms akimbo, a little fellow with white eyelashes. He looked as if he had known all the degradations and all the furies. He looked as if he had been cuffed, kicked, rolled in the mud. He looked as if he had been scratched, spat upon, pelted with unmentionable filth, and he smiled with a sense of security at the faces around. His ears were bending down under the weight of his battered felt hat. The torn tails of his black coat flapped in fringes about the calves of his legs. He unbuttoned the only two buttons that remained, and everyone saw that he had no shirt under it. It was his deserved misfortune that those rags which nobody could possibly be supposed to own looked on him as if they had been stolen. His neck was long and thin, his eyelids were red, rare hairs hung about his jaws. His shoulders were peaked and drooped like the broken wings of a bird. All his left side was caked with mud, which showed that he had lately slept in a wet ditch. He had saved his inefficient carcass from violent destruction by running away from an American ship, where, in a moment of forgetful folly, he had dared to engage himself. And he had knocked about for a fortnight ashore in the native quarter, cadging for drinks, starving, sleeping on rubbish heaps, wandering in sunshine. A startling visitor from a world of nightmares. He stood repulsive and smiling in the sudden silence, This clean white forecastle was his refuge, the place where he could be lazy, where he could wallow and lie and eat, and curse the food he ate, where he could display his talents for shirking work, for cheating, for cadging, where he could find, surely, someone to wheedle and someone to bully, and where he would be paid for doing all this. They all knew him. Is there a spot on earth where such a man is unknown? An ominous survival testifying to the eternal fitness of lies and impudence? A taciturn, long-armed shellback with hooked fingers, who had been lying on his back smoking, turned in his bed to examine him dispassionately, then over his head sent a long jet of clear saliva towards the door. They all knew him. He was the man that cannot steer, that cannot splice, that dodges the work on dark nights, that, aloft, holds on frantically with both arms and legs and swears at the wind, the sleet, the darkness. The man who curses the sea while others work. The man who is last out and the first in when all hands are called. The man who can't do most things and won't do the rest. The pet of philanthropists and self-seeking landlubbers. The sympathetic and deserving creature that knows all about his rights but knows nothing of courage, of endurance, and of the unexpressed faith, of the unspoken loyalty that knits together a ship's company. The independent offspring of the ignoble freedom of the slums, full of disdain and hate for the austere servitude of the sea. Someone cried at him, "What's your name?" "Donkin," he said, looking round with cheerful effrontery. "What are you?" asked another voice. "Why, a sailor like you, old man," he replied in a tone that meant to be hearty but was impudent. "Blimey if you don't look a blamed sight worse than a broken-down fireman," was the comment in a convinced mutter. Charlie lifted his head and piped in a cheeky voice, "He is a man and a sailor," then wiping his nose with the back of his hand, bent down industriously over his bit of rope. A few laughed. Others stared doubtfully. The ragged newcomer was indignant. "That's a fine way to welcome a chap into a forecastle," he snarled. "Are you men or a lot of artless cannibals?" "Don't take your shirt off for a word, shipmate," called out Belfast, jumping up in front, fiery, menacing, and friendly at the same time. "Is that a broke blind?" asked the indomitable scarecrow, looking right and left with affected surprise. "Can't he see I haven't got no shirt?" He held both his arms out crosswise and shook the rags that hung over his bones with dramatic effect. "'Cause why?" he continued very loud. "The bloody Yankee's been trying to jump my guts out 'cause I stood up for my rights like a good 'un. I am an Englishman, I am. They set upon me and I had to run. That's why. Ain't you never seed a man hard up? Yeah. What kind of blamed ship is this? I'm dead broke. I haven't got nothink. No bag, no bed, no blanket, no shirt, not a bloomin' rag but what I stand in. But I had the art to stand up agin them Yankees. Is any of you art enough to spare a pair of old pants for a chum?" He knew how to conquer the naive instincts of that crowd. In a moment they gave him their compassion, jocularly, contemptuously, or surlily. And at first it took the shape of a blanket thrown at him as he stood there with the white skin of his limbs showing his human kinship through the black fantasy of his rags. Then a pair of old shoes fell at his muddy feet. With a cry, "From under!" a rolled-up pair of canvas trousers, heavy with tar stains, struck him on the shoulder. The gust of their benevolence sent a wave of sentimental pity through their doubting hearts. They were touched by their own readiness to alleviate a shipmate's misery. Voices cried, "We will fit you out, old man." Murmur, "Never seed sich a hard case. Poor beggar. I've got an old singlet. Will that be of any use to you? Take it, matey." Those friendly murmurs filled the forecastle. He pawed around with his naked foot, gathering the things in a heap, and looked about for more. Unemotional Archie perfunctorily contributed to the pile an old cloth cap with the peak torn off. Old Singleton, lost in the serene regions of fiction, read on unheeding. Charlie, pitiless with the wisdom of youth, squeaked, "If you want brass buttons for your new uniforms, I've got 2 for you." The filthy object of universal charity shook his fist at the youngster. "I'll make you keep this here forecastle clean, young fella," he snarled viciously. "Never you fear, I will learn you to be civil to an able seaman, you ignorant ass." He glared harmfully, but saw Singleton shut his book, and his little beady eyes began to roam from berth to berth. "Take that bunk by the door there, it's pretty fair," suggested Belfast. So advised, he gathered the gifts at his feet, pressed them in a bundle against his breast, then looked cautiously at the Russian Finn, who stood on one side with an unconscious gaze, contemplating, perhaps, one of those weird visions that haunt the men of his race. "Get out of my road, Dutchy," said the victim of Yankee brutality. The Finn did not move, did not hear. "Get out, blast ye!" shouted the other, shoving him aside with his elbow. "Get out, you blanked deaf and dumb fool! Get out!" The man staggered, recovered himself, and gazed at the speaker in silence. "Those damned foreigners should be kept under," opined the amiable Duncan to the forecastle. "If you don't teach 'em their place, they put you on like anythink." He flung all his worldly possessions into the empty bed-place, gauged with another shrewd look the risks of the proceeding, then leaped up to the Finn, who stood pensive and dull. "I'll teach you to swell around," he yelled. "I'll plug your eyes for you, you bloomin' squarehead." Most of the men were now in their bunks, and the 2 had the forecastle clear to themselves. The development of the destitute Duncan aroused interest. He danced all in tatters before the amazed Finn, squaring from a distance at the heavy, unmoved face. 1 or 2 men cried encouragingly, "Go it, Whitechapel," settling themselves luxuriously in their beds to survey the fight. Others shouted, "Shut your row! Go and put your head in a bag." The hubbub was recommencing. Suddenly, many heavy blows, struck with a handspike on the deck above, boomed like discharges of small cannon through the forecastle. Then the boatswain's voice rose outside the door with an authoritative note in its drawl. "Do you hear, below there? Lay aft! Lay aft to muster all hands!" There was a moment of surprised stillness. Then the forecastle floor disappeared under men whose bare feet flopped on the planks as they sprang clear out of their berths. Caps were rooted for amongst tumbled blankets. Some, yawning, buttoned waistbands. Half-smoked pipes were knocked hurriedly against woodwork and stuffed under pillows. Voices growled, "What's up? Is there no rest for us?" Duncan yelped, "If that's the way of this ship, we'll have to change all that. You leave me alone. I will soon." None of the crowd noticed him. They were lurching in 2s and 3s through the doors after the manner of merchant jacks, who cannot go out of a door fairly like mere landsmen. The votary of change followed them. Singleton, struggling into his jacket, came last, tall and fatherly, bearing high his head of a weather-beaten sage on the body of an old athlete. Only Charlie remained alone in the white glare of the empty place, sitting between the 2 rows of iron links that stretched into the narrow gloom forward. He pulled hard at the strands in a hurried endeavor to finish his knot. Suddenly he started up, flung the rope at the cat, and skipped after the black tom, which went off leaping sedately over chain compressors with its tail carried stiff and upright like a small flagpole. Outside the glare of the steaming forecastle, the serene purity of the night enveloped the seaman with its soothing breath, with its tepid breath flowing under the stars that hung countless above the mastheads in a thin cloud of luminous dust. On the town side, the blackness of the water was streaked with trails of light, which undulated gently on slight ripples, similar to filaments that float rooted to the shore. Rows of other lights stood away in straight lines as if drawn up on parade between towering buildings. But on the other side of the harbor, somber hills arched high their black spines, on which here and there the point of a star resembled a spark fallen from the sky. Far off, by Culloway, the electric lamps at the dock gates shone on the end of lofty standards with a glow blinding and frigid like captive ghosts of some evil moons. Scattered all over the dark polish of the roadstead, The ships at anchor floated in perfect stillness under the feeble gleam of their riding lights, looming up, opaque and bulky, like strange and monumental structures abandoned by men to an everlasting repose. Before the cabin door, Mr. Baker was mustering the crew. As they stumbled and lurched along past the mainmast, they could see aft his round, broad face with a white paper before it, and beside his shoulder the sleepy head with dropped eyelids of the boy who held, suspended at the end of his raised arm, the luminous globe of a lamp. Even before the shuffle of naked souls had ceased along the decks, the mate began to call over the names. He called distinctly in a serious tone befitting this roll call to unquiet loneliness, to inglorious and obscure struggle, or to the more trying endurance of small privations and wearisome duties. As the chief mate read out a name, one of the men would answer, "Yes, sir," or "Here," and detaching himself from the shadowy mob of heads visible above the blackness of starboard bulwarks, would step barefooted into the circle of light, and in two noiseless strides pass into the shadows on the port side of the quarter-deck. They answered in divers tones, in thick mutters, in clear, ringing voices, and some, as if the whole thing had been an outrage on their feelings, used an injured intonation. For discipline is not ceremonious in merchant ships, where the sense of hierarchy is weak, and where all feel themselves equal before the unconcerned immensity of the sea and the exacting appeal of the work. Mr. Baker read on steadily. "Hanson, Campbell, Smith, Wamibo. Now then, Wamibo, why don't you answer? Always got to call your name twice." The Finn emitted at last an uncouth grunt, and, stepping out, passed through the patch of light, weird and gaudy, with the face of a man marching through a dream. The mate went on faster. "Craik, Singleton, Duncan." "Oh, Lord!" he involuntarily ejaculated, as the incredibly dilapidated figure appeared in the light. It stopped. It uncovered pale gums and long upper teeth in a malevolent grin. "Is there anything wrong with me, Mr. Mate?" it asked, with a flavor of insolence in the forced simplicity of its tone. On both sides of the deck subdued titters were heard. "That'll do! Go over!" growled Mr. Baker, fixing the new hand with steady blue eyes. And Duncan vanished suddenly out of the light into the dark group of mustered men, to be slapped on the back and to hear flattering whispers. "He ain't afeard he'll give sport to 'em, see if he don't. Reg'lar Punch and Judy show. D'you see the mate start at him? Well, damn me if I ever." The last man had gone over, and there was a moment of silence while the mate peered at his list. 16, 17, he muttered. "I'm one hand short, bo'sun," he said aloud. The big West countryman at his elbows, swarthy and bearded like a gigantic Spaniard, said in a rumbling bass, "There's no one left forward, sir. I had a look round. He ain't aboard, but he may turn up before daylight." "Aye, he may or he may not," commented the mate. "Can't make out that last name. It's all a smudge." "That will do, men. Go below." The distinct and motionless group stirred, broke up, began to move forward. "Wait!" cried a deep, ringing voice. All stood still. Mr. Baker, who had turned away yawning, spun round open-mouthed. At last, furious, he blurted out, "What's this? Who said wait? What—" But he saw a tall figure standing on the rail. It came down and pushed through the crowd, marching with a heavy tread towards the light on the quarter-deck. Then again the sonorous voice said with insistence, "Wait!" The lamplight lit up the man's body. He was tall. His head was away up in the shadows of lifeboats that stood on skids above the deck. The whites of his eyes and his teeth gleamed distinctly, but the face was indistinguishable. His hands were big and seemed gloved. Mr. Baker advanced intrepidly. "Who are you? How dare you—" he began. The boy, amazed like the rest, raised the light to the man's face. It was black. A surprised hum, a faint hum that sounded like the suppressed mutter of the word nigger, ran along the deck and escaped out into the night. The nigger seemed not to hear. He balanced himself where he stood in a swagger that marked time. After a moment he said calmly, "My name is Waite, James Waite." "Oh," said Mr. Baker. Then, after a few seconds of smoldering silence, his temper blazed out. "Ah, your name is Waite. What of that? What do you want? What do you mean, coming shouting here?" The nigger was calm, cool, towering, superb. The men had approached and stood behind him in a body. He overtopped the tallest by half a head. He said, "I belong to the ship." He enunciated distinctly with soft precision. The deep rolling tones of his voice filled the deck without effort. He was naturally scornful, unaffectedly condescending, as if from his height of 6'3" he had surveyed all the vastness of human folly, and had made up his mind not to be too hard on it. He went on. "The captain shipped me this morning. I couldn't get aboard sooner. I saw you all aft as I came up the ladder, and could see directly you were mustering the crew. Naturally, I called out my name. I thought you had it on your list and would understand. You misapprehended." He stopped short. The folly around him was confounded. He was right as ever, and as ever ready to forgive. The disdainful tones had ceased, and breathing heavily, he stood still, surrounded by all these white men. He held his head up in the glare of the lamp, a head vigorously modeled into deep shadows and shining lights, a head powerful and misshapen, with a tormented and flattened face, a face pathetic and brutal, the tragic, the mysterious, the repulsive mask of a nigger's soul. Mr. Baker, recovering his composure, looked at the paper close. "Oh, yes, that's so. All right, Waite, take your gear forward," he said. Suddenly the nigger's eyes rolled wildly, became all whites. He put his hand to his side and coughed twice. A cough metallic, hollow, and tremendously loud. It resounded like two explosions in a vault. The dome of the sky rang to it, and the iron plates of the ship's bulwarks seemed to vibrate in unison. Then he marched off forward with the others. The officers lingering by the cabin door could hear him say, "Won't some of you chaps lend a hand with my dunnage? I've got a chest and a bag." The words, spoken sonorously, with an even intonation, were heard all over the ship, and the question was put in the manner that made a refusal impossible. The short, quick shuffle of men carrying something heavy went away forward, but the tall figure of the nigger lingered by the main hatch in a knot of smaller shapes. Again he was heard asking, "Is your cook a colored gentleman?" Then a disappointed and disapproving, was his comment upon the information that the cook happened to be a mere white man. Yet, as they went all together towards the forecastle, he condescended to put his head through the galley door and boom out inside a magnificent "Good evening, Doctor," that made all the saucepans ring. In the dim light, the cook dozed on the coal locker in front of the captain's supper. He jumped up as if he had been cut with a whip and dashed wildly on deck to see the backs of several men going away laughing. Afterwards, when talking about that voyage, he used to say, "The poor fellow had scared me. I thought I'd seen the devil." The cook had been 7 years in the ship with the same captain. He was a serious-minded man with a wife and 3 children, whose society he enjoyed on an average 1 month out of 12. When on shore, he took his family to church twice every Sunday. At sea, he went to sleep every evening with his lamp turned up full, a pipe in his mouth, and an open Bible in his hand. Someone had always to go during the night to put out the light, take the book from his hand, and the pipe from between his teeth. "For," Belfast used to say, irritated and complaining, "some night, you stupid cookie, you'll swallow your old clay, and we will have no cook." "Ah, sonny, I am ready for my maker's call. Wish you all were," the other would answer with a benign serenity that was altogether imbecile and touching. Belfast, outside the galley door, danced with vexation. "You holy fool, I don't want you to die," he howled, looking up with furious, quivering face and tender eyes. "What's the hurry, you blessed wooden-headed old heretic? The devil will have you soon enough. Think of us, of us, of us!" And he would go away, stamping, spitting aside, disgusted and worried, while the other, stepping out, saucepan in hand, hot, begrimed, and placid, watched with a superior, cocksure smile the back of his queer little man, reeling in a rage. They were great friends. Mr. Baker, lounging over the after-hatch, sniffed the humid night in the company of the second mate. "Those West Indian niggers run fine and large, some of them. Ooh, don't they? A fine big man, that Mr. Creighton. Feel him on a rope, eh? Ooh, I will take him into my watch, I think." The second mate, a fair, gentlemanly young fellow with a resolute face and a splendid physique, observed quietly that it was just about what he expected. There could be felt in his tone some slight bitterness, which Mr. Baker very kindly set himself to argue away. "Come, come, young man," he said, grunting between the words. "Come, don't be too greedy. You had that big fin in your watch all the voyage. I will do what's fair. You may have those 2 young Scandinavians, and I get the nigger, and will take that cheeky costermonger chap in a black frock coat. I'll make him toe the mark, or my name isn't Baker. Oh. He grunted thrice, ferociously. He had that trick of grunting so between his words and at the end of sentences. It was a fine, effective grunt that went well with his menacing utterance, with his heavy, bull-necked frame, his jerky, rolling gait, with his big, seamed face, his steady eyes and sardonic mouth. But its effect had been long ago discounted by the men. They liked him. Belfast, who was a favorite and knew it, mimicked him, not quite behind his back. Charlie, but with greater caution, imitated his rolling gait. Some of his sayings became established daily quotations in the forecastle. Popularity can go no farther. Besides, all hands were ready to admit that on a fitting occasion the mate could jump down a fellow's throat in a regular Western Ocean style. Now he was giving his last orders. "You, Knowles, call all hands at 4. I want, to heave short before the tug comes. Look for the captain. I'm going to lie down in my clothes. Call me when you see the boat coming. The old man is sure to have something to say when he gets aboard," he remarked to Creighton. "Well, good night. A long day before us tomorrow. Better turn in now. Upon the dark deck a band of light flashed, then a door slammed, and Mr. Baker was gone into his neat cabin. Young Creighton stood leaning over the rail and looked dreamily into the night of the east, and he saw in it a long country lane, a lane of waving leaves and dancing sunshine. He saw stirring boughs of old trees outspread and framing in their arch the tender, the caressing blueness of an English sky. And through the arch a girl in a light dress, smiling under a sunshade, seemed to be stepping out of the tender sky. At the other end of the ship, the forecastle, with only one lamp burning now, was going to sleep in a dim emptiness traversed by loud breathings, by sudden short sighs. The double row of berths yawned black like graves tenanted by uneasy corpses. Here and there a curtain of gaudy chintz, half drawn, marked the resting place of a sybarite. A leg hung over the edge, very white and lifeless. An arm stuck out straight, with a dark palm turned up and thick fingers half closed. 2 light snores that did not synchronize quarreled in funny dialogue. Singleton, stripped again, the old man suffered much from prickly heat, stood cooling his back in the doorway with his arms crossed on his bare and unadorned chest. His head touched the beam of the deck above. The nigger, half undressed, was busy casting adrift the lashing of his box and spreading his bedding in an upper berth. He moved about in his socks, tall and noiseless, with a pair of braces beating about his calves. Amongst the shadows of stanchions and bowsprit, Duncan munched a piece of hard ship's bread, sitting on the deck with upturned feet and restless eyes. He held the biscuit up before his mouth in the whole fist and snapped his jaws at it with a raging face. Crumbs fell between his outspread legs, then he got up. "Where's our water cask?" he asked in a contained voice. Singleton, without a word, pointed with a big hand that held a short, smoldering pipe. Duncan bent over the cask, drank out of the tin, splashing the water, turned round and noticed the nigger looking at him over the shoulder with calm loftiness. He moved up sideways. "There's a bloomin' supper for a man," he whispered bitterly. "My dog at home wouldn't have it. It's fit enough for you and me.
Here's a big ship's forecastle, not a bloomin' scrap of meat in the kids. I've looked in all the lockers.
The nigger stared like a man addressed unexpectedly in a foreign language. Duncan changed his tone.
Give us a bit of baccy, mate, he breathed out confidentially. I haven't had smoke or chew for the last month. I am ramping mad for it. Come on, old man.
Don't be familiar, said the nigger. Duncan started and sat down on a chest nearby out of sheer surprise. We haven't kept pigs together, continued James Waite in a deep undertone. Here's your tobacco. Then, after a pause, he inquired, What ship?
Golden State,
muttered Duncan indistinctly, biting the tobacco. The nigger whistled low. Ran? He said curtly. Duncan nodded. One of his cheeks bulged out.
In course I ran, he mumbled. They booted the life out of one Dago chap on the passage here, then started on me. I cleared out here.
Left your dunnage behind?
Yes, dunnage and money,
answered Duncan, raising his voice a little.
I got nothing, no clothes, no bed. A bandy-legged little Irish chap here has given me a blanket. Think I'll go and sleep in the fore-topmast staysail tonight.
He went on deck, trailing behind his back a corner of the blanket. Singleton, without a glance, moved slightly aside to let him pass. The nigger put away his shore togs and sat in clean working clothes on his box, one arm stretched over his knees. After staring at Singleton for some time, he asked without emphasis, What kind of ship is this? Pretty fair, eh? Singleton didn't stir. A long while after, he said with unmoved face, Ship? Ships are all right. It is the men in them. He went on smoking. The wisdom of half a century spent in listening to the thunder of the waves had spoken unconsciously through his old lips. The cat purred on the windlass. Then James Waite had a fit of roaring, rattling cough that shook him, tossed him like a hurricane, and flung him, panting, with staring eyes, headlong on his sea chest. Several men woke up. One said sleepily out of his bunk, "'Struth, what a blamed row!" "I have a cold on my chest," gasped Waite. "Cold, you call it," grumbled the man. "Should think 'twas something more." "Oh, you think so?" said the nigger, upright and loftily scornful again. He climbed into his berth and began coughing persistently while he put his head out to glare all round the forecastle. There was no further protest. He fell back on the pillow and could be heard there, wheezing regularly like a man oppressed in his sleep. Singleton stood at the door with his face to the light and his back to the darkness. And alone in the dim emptiness of the sleeping forecastle he appeared bigger, colossal, very old, old as Father Time himself, who should have come there into this place as quiet as a sepulchre, to contemplate with patient eyes the short victory of sleep, the consoler. Yet he was only a child of time, a lonely relic of a devoured and forgotten generation. He stood, still strong, as ever unthinking, a ready man with a vast, empty past and with no future, with his childlike impulses and his man's passions already dead within his tattooed breast. The men who could understand his silence were gone, those men who knew how to exist beyond the pale of life and within sight of eternity. They had been strong, as those are strong who know neither doubts nor hopes. They had been impatient and enduring, turbulent and devoted, unruly and faithful. Well-meaning people had tried to represent those men as whining over every mouthful of their food, as going about their work in fear of their lives. But in truth, they had been men who knew toil, privation, violence, debauchery, but knew not fear, and had no desire of spite in their hearts. Men hard to manage, but easy to inspire, voiceless men, but men enough to scorn in their hearts the sentimental voices that bewailed the hardness of their fate. It was a fate unique and their own. The capacity to bear it appeared to them the privilege of the chosen. Their generation lived inarticulate and indispensable, without knowing the sweetness of affections or the refuge of a home, and died free from the dark menace of a narrow grave. They were the everlasting children of the mysterious sea. Their successors are the grown-up children of a discontented earth. They are less naughty, but less innocent, less profane, but perhaps also less believing. And if they have learned how to speak, they have also learned how to whine. But the others were strong and mute. They were effaced, bowed, and enduring, like stone caryatids that hold up in the night the lighted halls of a resplendent and glorious edifice. They are gone now, and it does not matter. The sea and the earth are unfaithful to their children. A truth, a faith, a generation of men goes and is forgotten, and it does not matter. Except perhaps to the few of those who believed the truth, confessed the faith, or loved the men. A breeze was coming. The ship that had been lying tide-rode swung to a heavier puff, and suddenly the slack of the chain cable between the windlass and the hawse pipe clinked, slipped forward an inch, and rose gently off the deck with a startling suggestion, as of unsuspected life that had been lurking stealthily in the iron. In the hawse pipe, the grinding links sent through the ship a sound like a low groan of a man sighing under a burden. The strain came on the windlass. The chain tautened like a string, vibrated, and the handle of the screw brake moved in slight jerks. Singleton stepped forward. Till then he had been standing, meditative and unthinking, reposeful and hopeless, with a face grim and blank, a 60-year-old child of the mysterious sea. The thoughts of all his lifetime could have been expressed in 6 words, but the stir of those things that were as much part of his existence as his beating heart called up a gleam of alert understanding upon the sternness of his aged face. The flame of the lamp swayed, and the old man with knitted and bushy eyebrows stood over the break, watchful and motionless in the wild saraband of dancing shadows. Then the ship, obedient to the call of her anchor, forged ahead slightly and eased the strain. The cable relieved, hung down, and after swaying imperceptibly to and fro, dropped with a loud tap on the hard wood planks. Singleton seized the high lever, and by a violent throw forward of his body, wrung out another half-turn from the brake. He recovered himself, breathed largely, and remained for a while glaring down at the powerful and compact engine that squatted on the deck at his feet like some quiet monster, a creature amazing and tame. "You hold," he growled at it, masterfully, in the incult tangle of his white beard. Chapter 2. Next morning, at daylight, the Narcissus went to sea. A slight haze blurred the horizon. Outside the harbor, the measureless expanse of smooth water lay sparkling like a floor of jewels, and as empty as the sky. The short black tug gave a pluck to windward in the usual way, then let go the rope and hovered for a moment on the quarter with her engines stopped, while the slim, long hull of the ship moved ahead slowly under lower topsails. The loose upper canvas blew out in the breeze with soft round contours, resembling small white clouds snared in the maze of ropes. Then the sheets were hauled home, the yards hoisted, and the ship became a high and lonely pyramid, gliding, all shining and white, through the sunlit mist. The tug turned short round and went away towards the land. 26 pairs of eyes watched her low, broad stern crawling languidly over the smooth swell between the 2 paddle wheels that turned fast, beating the water with fierce hurry. She resembled an enormous and aquatic black beetle, surprised by the light, overwhelmed by the sunshine, trying to escape with ineffectual effort into the distant gloom of the land. She left a lingering smudge of smoke on the sky, and 2 vanishing trails of foam on the water. On the place where she had stopped, a round black patch of soot remained, undulating on the swell, an unclean mark of the creature's rest. The Narcissus, left alone, heading south, seemed to stand resplendent and still upon the restless sea under the moving sun. Flakes of foam swept past her sides, The water struck her with flashing blows. The land glided away, slowly fading. A few birds screamed on motionless wings over the swaying mastheads. But soon the land disappeared, the birds went away, and to the west the pointed sail of an Arab dhow running for Bombay rose triangular and upright above the sharp edge of the horizon, lingered and vanished like an illusion. Then the ship's wake, long and straight, stretched itself out through a day of immense solitude. The setting sun, burning on the level of the water, flamed crimson below the blackness of heavy rain clouds. The sunset squall, coming up from behind, dissolved itself into the short deluge of a hissing shower. It left the ship glistening from trunks to waterline, and with darkened sails. She ran easily before a fair monsoon, with her decks cleared for the night, and moving along with her was heard the sustained and monotonous swishing of the waves, mingled with the low whispers of men mustered aft for the setting of watches, the short plaint of some block aloft, or, now and then, a loud sigh of wind. Mr. Baker, coming out of his cabin, called out the first name sharply before closing the door behind him. He was going to take charge of the deck. On the homeward trip, according to an old custom of the sea, the chief officer takes the first night watch, from 8 till midnight. So Mr. Baker, after he had heard the last "Yes, sir," said moodily, "Relieve the wheel and look out," and climbed with heavy feet the poop ladder to windward. Soon after, Mr. Creighton came down, whistling softly, and went into the cabin. On the doorstep the steward lounged in slippers, meditative, and with his shirt-sleeves rolled up to the armpits. On the main deck the cook, locking up the galley doors, had an altercation with young Charlie about a pair of socks. He could be heard saying impressively in the darkness amidships, "You don't deserve a kindness. I've been drying them for you, and now you complain about the holes, and you swear, too, right in front of me. If I hadn't been a Christian, which you ain't, you young ruffian, I would give you a clout on the head. Go away." Men in couples or threes stood pensive or moved silently along the bulwarks in the waist. The first busy day of a homeward passage was sinking into the dull peace of resumed routine. Aft, on the high poop, Mr. Baker walked, shuffling, and grunted to himself in the pauses of his thoughts. Forward, the lookout man, erect between the flukes of the two anchors, hummed an endless tune, keeping his eyes fixed dutifully ahead in a vacant stare. A multitude of stars, coming out into the clear night, peopled the emptiness of the sky. They glittered as if alive above the sea. They surrounded the running ship on all sides, more intense than the eyes of a staring crowd, and as inscrutable as the souls of men. The passage had begun, and the ship, a fragment detached from the earth, went on, lonely and swift, like a small planet. Round her, the abysses of sky and sea met in an unattainable frontier. A great circular solitude moved with her, ever changing and ever the same, always monotonous and always imposing. Now and then another wandering white speck burdened with life appeared far off, disappeared, intent on its own destiny. The sun looked upon her all day, and every morning rose with a burning round stare of undying curiosity. She had her own future. She was alive with the lives of those beings who trod her decks. Like that earth which had given her up to the sea, she had an intolerable load of regrets and hopes. On her lived timid truth and audacious lies, and like the earth she was unconscious, fair to see, and condemned by men to an ignoble fate. The august loneliness of her path lent dignity to the sordid inspiration of her pilgrimage. She drove foaming to the southward, as if guided by the courage of a high endeavor. The smiling greatness of the sea dwarfed the extent of time. The days raced after one another, brilliant and quick like the flashes of a lighthouse, and the nights, eventful and short, resembled fleeting dreams. The men had shaken into their places, and the half-hourly voice of the bells ruled their life of unceasing care. Night and day the head and shoulders of a seaman could be seen aft by the wheel, outlined high against sunshine or starlight, very steady above the stir of revolving spokes. The faces changed, passing in rotation. Youthful faces, bearded faces, dark faces, faces serene or faces moody, but all akin with the brotherhood of the sea, all with the same attentive expression of eyes carefully watching the compass or the sails. Captain Allistoun, serious and with an old red muffler round his throat, all day long pervaded the poop. At night many times he rose out of the darkness of the companion, such as a phantom above a grave, and stood watchful and mute under the stars, his nightshirt fluttering like a flag, then without a sound sank down again. He was born on the shores of the Pentland Firth. In his youth he attained the rank of harpooner in Peterhead whalers. When he spoke of that time, his restless gray eyes became still and cold, like the loom of ice. Afterwards he went into the East Indian trade for the sake of change. He had commanded the Narcissus since she was built. He loved his ship, and drove her unmercifully, for his secret ambition was to make her accomplish some day a brilliantly quick passage which would be mentioned in nautical papers. He pronounced his owner's name with a sardonic smile, spoke but seldom to his officers, and reproved errors in a gentle voice with words that cut to the quick. His hair was iron gray, his face hard and of the color of pump leather. He shaved every morning of his life at 6, but once, being caught in a fierce hurricane 80 miles southward of Mauritius, he had missed 3 consecutive days. He feared naught but an unforgiving God, and wished to end his days in a little house with a plot of ground attached, far in the country, out of sight of the sea. He, the ruler of that minute world, seldom descended from the Olympian heights of his poop. Below him, at his feet, so to speak, common mortals led their busy and insignificant lives. Along the main deck Mr. Baker grunted in a manner bloodthirsty and innocuous, and kept all our noses to the grindstone, being, as he once remarked, paid for doing that very thing. The men working about the deck were healthy and contented, as most seamen are when once well out to sea. The true peace of God begins at any spot 1,000 miles from the nearest land, and when he sends there the messengers of his might, it is not in terrible wrath against crime, presumption, and folly, but paternally, to chasten simple hearts, ignorant hearts that know nothing of life, and beat undisturbed by envy or greed. In the evening, the cleared decks had a reposeful aspect, resembling the autumn of the earth. The sun was sinking to rest, wrapped in a mantle of warm clouds. Forward, on the end of the spare spars, the boatswain and the carpenter sat together with crossed arms. 2 men, friendly, powerful, and deep-chested. Beside them, the short, dumpy sailmaker, who had been in the Navy, related between the whiffs of his pipe impossible stories about admirals. Couples tramped backwards and forwards, keeping step and balance without effort in a confined space. Pigs grunted in the big pigsty. Belfast, leaning thoughtfully on his elbow above the bars, communed with them through the silence of his meditation. Fellows with shirts open wide on sunburnt breasts sat upon the mooring bitts, and all up the steps of the forecastle ladders. By the foremast, a few discussed in a circle the characteristics of a gentleman. One said, "It's money as does it." Another maintained, "No, it's the way they speak." Lame Knowles stumped up with an unwashed face, he had the distinction of being the dirty man of the forecastle, and showing a few yellow fangs in a shrewd smile, explained craftily that he had seen some of their pants. The backsides of them, he had observed, were thinner than paper from constant sitting down in offices. Yet otherwise they looked first-rate and would last for years. It was all appearance. It was, he said, bloomin' easy to be a gentleman when you had a clean job for life. They disputed endlessly, obstinate and childish. They repeated in shouts and with inflamed faces their amazing arguments. while the soft breeze, eddying down the enormous cavity of the foresail, distended above their bare heads, stirred the tumbled hair with a touch passing and light like an indulgent caress. They were forgetting their toil. They were forgetting themselves. The cook approached to hear and stood by, beaming with the inward consciousness of his faith, like a conceited saint unable to forget his glorious reward. Donkin, solitary and brooding over his wrongs on the forecastle head, moved closer to catch the drift of the discussion below him. He turned his sallow face to the sea, and his thin nostrils moved, sniffing the breeze, as he lounged negligently by the rail. In the glow of sunset, faces shone with interest, teeth flashed, eyes sparkled. The walking couples stood still suddenly with broad grins. A man bending over a washtub sat up, entranced, with the soapsuds flecking his wet arms. Even the three petty officers listened, leaning back, comfortably propped, and with superior smiles. Belfast left off scratching the ear of his favorite pig, and, open-mouthed, tried with eager eyes to have his say. He lifted his arms, grimacing and baffled. From a distance, Charlie screamed at the ring, "I know about gentlemen more'n any of you. I've been intimate with 'em. I've blacked their boots." The cook, craning his neck to hear better, was scandalized. "Keep your mouth shut when your elders speak, you impudent young heathen, you." "All right, old hallelujah, I'm done," answered Charlie soothingly. At some opinion of Dirty Knowles, delivered with an air of supernatural cunning, a ripple of laughter ran along, rose like a wave, burst with a startling roar. They stamped with both feet. They turned their shouting faces to the sky. Many, spluttering, slapped their thighs, while one or two bent double, gasped, hugging themselves with both arms like men in pain. The carpenter and the boatswain, without changing their attitude, shook with laughter where they sat. The sailmaker, charged with an anecdote about a commodore, looked sulky. The cook was wiping his eyes with a greasy rag, and lame Knowles, astonished at his own success, stood in their midst, showing a slow smile. Suddenly the face of Donkin, leaning high-shouldered over the after-rail, became grave. Something like a weak rattle was heard through the forecastle door. It became a murmur. It ended in a sighing groan. The washerman plunged both his arms into the tub abruptly. The cook became more crestfallen than an exposed backslider. The boatswain moved his shoulders uneasily. The carpenter got up with a spring and walked away, while the sailmaker seemed mentally to give his story up and began to puff at his pipe with somber determination. In the blackness of the doorway, a pair of eyes glimmered white and big and staring. Then James Waite's head, protruding, became visible, as if suspended between the two hands that grasped a doorpost on each side of the face. The tassel of his blue woolen nightcap, cocked forward, danced gaily over his left eyelid. He stepped out in a tottering stride. He looked powerful as ever, but showed a strange and affected unsteadiness in his gait. His face was perhaps a trifle thinner, and his eyes appeared rather startlingly prominent. He seemed to hasten the retreat of departing light by his very presence. The setting sun dipped sharply, as though fleeing before our nigger. A black mist emanated from him, a subtle and dismal influence, a something cold and gloomy that floated out and settled on all the faces like a mourning veil. The circle broke up. The joy of laughter died on stiffened lips. There was not a smile left among all the ship's company. Not a word was spoken. Many turned their backs, trying to look unconcerned. Others, with averted heads, sent half-reluctant glances out of the corners of their eyes. They resembled criminals, conscious of misdeeds more than honest men distracted by doubt. Only 2 or 3 stared frankly, but stupidly, with lips slightly open. All expected James Waite to say something, and at the same time had the air of knowing beforehand what he would say. He leaned his back against the doorpost, and with heavy eyes swept over them a glance domineering and pained, like a sick tyrant overawing a crowd of abject but untrustworthy slaves. No one went away. They waited in fascinated dread. He said ironically with gasps between the words, "Thank you, chaps. You are nice. And quiet, you are. Yelling so before the door." He made a longer pause, during which he worked his ribs in an exaggerated labor of breathing. It was intolerable. Feet were shuffled. Belfast let out a groan, but Donkin, above, blinked his red eyelids with invisible eyelashes and smiled bitterly over the nigger's head. The nigger went on again with surprising ease. He gasped no more, and his voice rang hollow and loud as though he had been talking in an empty cavern. He was contemptuously angry. "I tried to get a week of sleep. You know I can't sleep o' nights, and you come jabbering near the door here like a blooming lot of old women. You think yourselves good shipmates, do you? Much you care for a dying man." Belfast spun away from the pigsty. "Jimmy," he cried tremulously, "if you hadn't been sick, I would—" He stopped. The nigger waited a while, then said in a gloomy tone, "You would what?" "Go and fight another such one as yourself. Leave me alone. It won't be for long. I'll soon die. It's coming right enough." Men stood around very still and with exasperated eyes. It was just what they had expected and hated to hear, that idea of a stalking death, thrust at them many times a day like a boast and like a menace by this obnoxious nigger. He seemed to take a pride in that death which, so far, had attended only upon the ease of his life. He was overbearing about it, as if no one else in the world had ever been intimate with such a companion. He paraded it unceasingly before us with an affectionate persistence that made its presence indubitable and at the same time incredible. No man could be suspected of such monstrous friendship. Was he a reality, or was he a sham, this ever-expected visitor of Jimmy's? We hesitated between pity and mistrust, while on the slightest provocation he shook before our eyes the bones of his bothersome and infamous skeleton. He was forever trotting him out. He would talk of that coming death as though it had been already there, as if it had been walking the deck outside, as if it would presently come in to sleep in the only empty bunk, as if it had sat by his side at every meal. It interfered daily with our occupations, with our leisure, with our amusements. We had no songs and no music in the evening because Jimmy, we all lovingly called him Jimmy to conceal our hate of his accomplice, had managed with that prospective decease of his to disturb even Archie's mental balance. Archie was the owner of the concertina, but after a couple of stinging lectures from Jimmy, he refused to play any more. He said, "Yon's an uncanny joker. I dinna ken what's wrang with him, but there's something vera wrong, vera wrong. It's nae manner of use asking me, I won't play." Our singers became mute because Jimmy was a dying man. For the same reason, no chap, as Knowles remarked, could drive in a nail to hang his few poor rags upon without being made aware of the enormity he committed in disturbing Jimmy's interminable last moments. At night, instead of the cheerful yell, "One bell, turn out, do you hear there? Hey, 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 show leg," the watches were called man by man in whispers so as not to interfere with Jimmy's possibly last slumber on earth. True, he was always awake, and managed, as we sneaked out on deck, to plant in our backs some cutting remark that, for the moment, made us feel as if we had been brutes, and afterwards made us suspect ourselves of being fools. We spoke in low tones within that forecastle as though it had been a church. We ate our meals in silence and dread, for Jimmy was capricious with his food, and railed bitterly at the salt meat, at the biscuits, at the tea, as at articles unfit for human consumption, let alone for a dying man. He would say, "Can't you find a better slice of meat for a sick man who's trying to get home to be cured or buried? But there, if I had a chance, you fellows would do away with it. You would poison me. Look at what you have given me." We served him in his bed with rage and humility, as though we had been the base courtiers of a hated prince, and he rewarded us by his unconciliating criticism. He had found the secret of keeping forever on the run the fundamental imbecility of mankind. He had the secret of life, that confounded dying man, and he made himself master of every moment of our existence. We grew desperate and remained submissive. Emotional little Belfast was forever on the verge of assault or on the verge of tears. One evening he confided to Archie, "For a halfpenny I would knock his ugly black head off, the skulking dodger," and the straightforward Archie pretended to be shocked. Such was the infernal spell which that casual St. Kitts nigger had cast upon our guileless manhood. But the same night Belfast stole from the galley the officer's Sunday fruit pie to tempt the fastidious appetite of Jimmy. He endangered not only his long friendship with the cook, but also, as it appeared, his eternal welfare. The cook was overwhelmed with grief. He did not know the culprit, but he knew that wickedness flourished. He knew that Satan was abroad amongst those men whom he looked upon as in some way under his spiritual care. Whenever he saw 3 or 4 of us standing together, he would leave his stove to run out and preach. We fled from him, and only Charlie, who knew the thief, affronted the cook with a candid gaze which irritated the good man. "It's you, I believe," he groaned, sorrowful and with a patch of soot on his chin. "It's you. You are a brand for the burning. No more of your socks in my galley." Soon, unofficially, the information was spread about that, should there be another case of stealing, our marmalade, an extra allowance, half a pound per man, would be stopped. Mr. Baker ceased to heap jocular abuse upon his favorites, and grunted suspiciously at all. The captain's cold eyes, high up on the poop, glittered mistrustful as he surveyed us trooping in a small mob from halyards to braces for the usual evening pull at all the ropes. Such stealing in a merchant ship is difficult to check, and may be taken as a declaration by men of their dislike for their officers. It is a bad symptom. It may end in God knows what trouble. The Narcissus was still a peaceful ship, but mutual confidence was shaken. Donkin did not conceal his delight. We were dismayed. Then illogical Belfast reproached our nigger with great fury. James Waite, with his elbow on the pillow, choked, gasped out, "Did I ask you to bone the dratted thing? Blow your damned pie. It has made me worse, you little Irish lunatic, you." Belfast, with scarlet face and trembling lips, made a dash at him. Every man in the forecastle rose with a shout. There was a moment of wild tumult. Someone shrieked piercingly, "Easy, Belfast, easy!" We expected Belfast to strangle Waite without more ado. Dust flew. We heard through it the nigger's cough, metallic and explosive like a gong. Next moment we saw Belfast hanging over him. He was saying plaintively, Don't, Jimmy, don't be like that. An angel couldn't put up with you, sick as ye are." He looked round at us from Jimmy's bedside, his comical mouth twitching, and through tearful eyes. Then he tried to put straight the disarranged blankets. The unceasing whisper of the sea filled the forecastle. Was James Waite frightened, or touched, or repentant? He lay on his back with a hand to his side, and as motionless as if his expected visitor had come at last. Belfast fumbled about his feet, repeating with emotion, "Yes, we know, ye are bad, but just say what ye want done, and we all know ye are bad, very bad." No. Decidedly James Waite was not touched or repentant. True to say, he seemed rather startled. He sat up with incredible suddenness and ease. "Ah, you think I am bad, do you?" he said gloomily in his clearest baritone voice. To hear him speak sometimes, you would never think there was anything wrong with that man. "Do you? Well, act according. Some of you haven't sense enough to put a blanket shipshape over a sick man. There, leave it alone. I can die anyhow." Belfast turned away limply with a gesture of discouragement. In the silence of the forecastle, full of interested men, Duncan pronounced distinctly, "Well, I'm blowed," and sniggered. Waite looked at him. He looked at him in quite a friendly manner. Nobody could tell what would please our incomprehensible invalid. but for us the scorn of that snigger was hard to bear. Donkin's position in the forecastle was distinguished but unsafe. He stood on the bad eminence of a general dislike. He was left alone, and in his isolation he could do nothing but think of the gales of the Cape of Good Hope, and envious the possession of warm clothing and waterproofs. Our sea boots, our oilskin coats, our well-filled sea chests were to him so many causes for bitter meditation. He had none of those things, and he felt instinctively that no man, when the need arose, would offer to share them with him. He was impudently cringing to us and systematically insolent to the officers. He anticipated the best results for himself from such a line of conduct, and was mistaken. Such natures forget that under extreme provocation men will be just, whether they want to be so or not. Donkin's insolence to long-suffering Mr. Baker became at last intolerable to us, and we rejoiced when the mate one dark night tamed him for good. It was done neatly, with great decency and decorum, but with little noise. We had been called, just before midnight, to trim the yards, and Donkin, as usual, made insulting remarks. We stood sleepily in a row with the forebrace in our hands, waiting for the next order, and heard in the darkness a scuffly trampling of feet, an exclamation of surprise, sounds of cuffs and slaps, suppressed, hissing whispers. "Ah, will you? Don't, then behave. Oh! Afterwards there were soft thuds mixed with the rattle of iron things, as if a man's body had been tumbling helplessly amongst the main pump rods. Before we could realize the situation, Mr. Baker's voice was heard very near and a little impatient. "Haul away, men! Lay back on that rope!" And we did lay back on the rope with great alacrity. As if nothing had happened, the chief mate went on trimming the yards with his usual and exasperating fastidiousness. We didn't at the time see anything of Donkin, and did not care. Had the chief officer thrown him overboard, no man would have said as much as, "Hello, he's gone." But in truth, no great harm was done, even if Donkin did lose one of his front teeth. We perceived this in the morning, and preserved a ceremonious silence. The etiquette of the forecastle commanded us to be blind and dumb in such a case, and we cherished the decencies of our life more than ordinary landsmen respect theirs. Charlie, with unpardonable want of savoir-vivre, yelled out, "Have you been to your dentist? Hurt you, didn't it?" He got a box on the ear from one of his best friends. The boy was surprised and remained plunged in grief for at least 3 hours. We were sorry for him, but youth requires even more discipline than age. Donkin grinned venomously. From that day he became pitiless, told Jimmy that he was a black fraud, hinted to us that we were an imbecile lot daily taken in by a vulgar nigger, and Jimmy seemed to like the fellow. Singleton lived untouched by human emotions. Taciturn and unsmiling, he breathed amongst us in that alone resembling the rest of the crowd. We were trying to be decent chaps, and found it jolly difficult. We oscillated between the desire of virtue and the fear of ridicule. We wished to save ourselves from the pain of remorse, but did not want to be made the contemptible dupes of our sentiment. Jimmy's hateful accomplice seemed to have blown with his impure breath undreamt of subtleties into our hearts. We were disturbed and cowardly, that we knew. Singleton seemed to know nothing, understand nothing. We had thought him till then as wise as he looked, but now we dared at times suspect him of being stupid from old age. One day, however, at dinner, as we sat on our boxes round a tin dish that stood on the deck within the circle of our feet, Jimmy expressed his general disgust with men and things in words that were particularly disgusting. Singleton lifted his head. We became mute. The old man, addressing Jimmy, asked, "Are you dying?" Thus interrogated, James Waite appeared horribly startled and confused. We all were startled. Mouths remained open, hearts thumped, eyes blinked. A dropped tin fork rattled in the dish. A man rose as if to go out and stood still. In less than a minute, Jimmy pulled himself together. "Why, can't you see I am?" he answered shakily. Singleton lifted a piece of soaked biscuit. His teeth, he declared, had no edge on them now, to his lips. "Well, get on with your dying," he said with venerable mildness. "Don't raise a blamed fuss with us over that job. We can't help you." Jimmy fell back in his bunk, and for a long time lay very still, wiping the perspiration off his chin. The dinner tins were put away quickly. On deck we discussed the incident in whispers. Some showed a chuckling exultation. Many looked grave. Wamibo, after long periods of staring dreaminess, attempted abortive smiles, and one of the young Scandinavians, much tormented by doubt, ventured in the second dog watch to approach Singleton — the old man did not encourage us much to speak to him — and ask sheepishly, "You think he will die?" Singleton looked up. "Why, of course he will die," he said deliberately. This seemed decisive. It was promptly imparted to everyone by him who had consulted the oracle. Shy and eager, he would step up and with averted gaze recite his formula. "Old Singleton says he will die." It was a relief. At last we knew that our compassion would not be misplaced, and we could again smile without misgivings. But we reckoned without Donkin. Donkin didn't want to have no truck with him, dirty foreigners. When Nilsson came to him with the news, "Singleton says he will die," he answered him by a spiteful, "And so will you fat-headed Dutchman. Wish you Dutchmen were all dead, 'stead comin' taking our money into your starving country." We were appalled. We perceived that after all, Singleton's answer meant nothing. We began to hate him for making fun of us. All our certitudes were going. We were on doubtful terms with our officers. The cook had given us up for lost. We had overheard the boatswain's opinion that we were a crowd of softies. We suspected Jimmy, one another, and even our very selves. We did not know what to do. At every insignificant turn of our humble life, we met Jimmy, overbearing and blocking the way, arm in arm with his awful and veiled familiar. It was a weird servitude. It began a week after leaving Bombay and came on us stealthily like any other great misfortune. Everyone had remarked that Jimmy from the first was very slack at his work, but we thought it simply the outcome of his philosophy of life. Donkin said, "You put no more weight on a rope than a bloody sparrer." He disdained him. Belfast, ready for a fight, exclaimed provokingly, "You don't kill yourself, old man." "Would you?" he retorted with extreme scorn, and Belfast retired. One morning, as we were washing decks, Mr. Baker called to him, "Bring your broom over here, Waite." He strolled languidly. "Move yourself." "Oof," grunted Mr. Baker. "What's the matter with your hind legs?" He stopped dead short. He gazed slowly with eyes that bulged out with an expression audacious and sad. "It isn't my legs," he said. "It's my lungs." Everybody listened. What's wrong with them?" inquired Mr. Baker. All the watch stood around on the wet deck, grinning and with brooms or buckets in their hands. He said mournfully, "Going, or gone. Can't you see I'm a dying man? I know it." Mr. Baker was disgusted. "Then why the devil did you ship aboard here?" "I must live till I die, mustn't I?" he replied. The grins became audible. "Go off the deck. Get out of my sight," said Mr. Baker. He was nonplussed. It was a unique experience. James Waite, obedient, dropped his broom and walked slowly forward. A burst of laughter followed him. It was too funny. All hands laughed. They laughed. Alas! He became the tormentor of all our moments. He was worse than a nightmare. You couldn't see that there was anything wrong with him. A nigger does not show. He was not very fat, certainly, but then he was no leaner than other niggers we had known. He coughed often, but the most prejudiced person could perceive that mostly he coughed when it suited his purpose. He wouldn't or couldn't do his work, and he wouldn't lie up. One day he would skip aloft with the best of them, and next time we would be obliged to risk our lives to get his limp body down. He was reported, he was examined, he was remonstrated with, threatened, cajoled, lectured. He was called into the cabin to interview the captain. There were wild rumors. It was said he had cheeked the old man. It was said he had frightened him. Charlie maintained that the skipper, weepin', as give him his blessing and a pot of jam. Knowles had it from the steward that the unspeakable Jimmy had been reeling against the cabin furniture, that he had groaned, that he had complained of general brutality and disbelief, and had ended by coughing all over the old man's meteorological journals, which were then spread on the table. At any rate, Waite returned forward, supported by the steward, who in a pained and shocked voice entreated us, "Here, catch hold of him, one of you. He is to lie up." Jimmy drank a tin mugful of coffee, and after bullying first one and then another, went to bed. He remained there most of the time, but when it suited him, would come on deck and appear amongst us. He was scornful and brooding. He looked ahead upon the sea, and no one could tell what was the meaning of that black man sitting apart in a meditative attitude and as motionless as a carving.